It is clear that every civilization undergoes a process of historical change. We can see that a civilization comes into existence, passes through a long experience, and eventually goes out of existence. We know, for example, that Mesopotamian civilization did not exist about 10,000 BC. It did exist about 3000 BC. It had ceased to exist by AD 1000. Similarly, it is clear that classical civilization did not exist about 1500 BC. It clearly did exist about 500 BC. And it had obviously passed out of existence by AD 1000. And, finally, it is clear that Western civilization did not exist about AD 500. It did exist in full flower about AD 1500, and it will surely pass out of existence at some time in the future, perhaps before AD 2500. Now, while everyone will probably agree with all this, it would be difficult to obtain agreement on any specific dates on which these events occurred. This difficulty arises from the fact that civilizations come into existence, rise and flourish, and go out of existence by a slow process which covers decades or even centuries, and historians are unable to agree on any precise dates for these events. This is perfectly proper. If classical civilization came into existence by a slow process and went out of existence by a slow process, it would give a false appearance of rigidity to fix its dates, say at 1184 B.C.A.D. 476, as has sometimes been done. In the following discussion, it should be remembered that the dates given for historical periods are only approximate. Beyond recognizing that civilizations begin and end, historians are fairly well agreed that, after they begin, they flourish and grow for a while, that eventually they reach a peak of power and prosperity, and that they weaken and decay before their final end. This process of evolution of civilizations can only be studied in an effective fashion if we divide it into a number of consecutive periods. We might divide it into two periods, such as rise and decline. We might divide it into three periods, such as youth, maturity, and old age. Or we might divide it into 5 or 50 periods. The process of change in the history of any civilization is a continuum, and, accordingly, the periods into which we may divide it are arbitrary and imaginary. Thus, it might be argued that one system of periodization is as good as another, and, accordingly, we are free to divide it in any way that seems to fit our purpose at the moment. To some extent this is true, as long as we are aware that our periods are subjective, but necessary, divisions. However, it is not completely true that one periodization is as good as another, although any system of periodization may well be useful for some specific purpose. Obviously, periodization must depend on changes in the society's culture, and, equally obviously, changes in a culture must depend on the causes of these changes. Accordingly, the periodization should, ideally, depend on the causes of the culture changes. This rule has been consistently neglected in all discussion of this subject. Writers tell us that a civilization rises and falls. They divide this process into periods, and they sometimes try to explain why it rises and falls, but they rarely relate their periods of the process of change to their explanation of the causes of the change. The most popular explanation of the causes of historical change, and especially of the rise and fall of civilizations, has been by means of some biological analogy in which a people, once young and vigorous, were softened and weakened by rising standards of living, or by the loss of the ideology of hard work and self-sacrifice that had made their rise possible. In most cases little or no effort has been made to correlate this process of change with the various stages through which the civilization was said to have passed. In some cases this softening of fiber theory has been presented in a more naive form by a simple biological analogy in which civilizations, like man himself, were felt to pass through a simple sequence of youth, maturity, and old age. In many cases no real explanation of the process of change has been given at all, the theorists in question being satisfied with attaching names to the various stages of historical change. Giovanni Battista Vico, for example, saw the history of each people as a process by which barbarian vigor slowly developed into rationalism, the period of greatest success being merely the middle period when the two qualities of vigor and rationality were in the fruitful, precarious, and temporary balance, while the decline was due to the final triumph of rationalism over energy. In the late 19th century, as biological sciences became more influential, these basic ideas were reserved with varying quantities of biological sauces. The Russian thinker Nikolai Danilevsky attributed the earlier period of vigor to biologic mixture of peoples, and attributed the intermediate ages of greatest achievement to the rise of a state organization that could direct such energies into more productive channels. The final stage of decay is not clearly explained but seems to be attributed to some process of political institutionalization not too remote from the explanation offered here. At the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, the influences of Darwinian thinking became dominant in theories of civilization dynamics. W. M. Flinders Petrie in 1911 offered the Darwinian version of the theories of earlier writers such as Danilevsky. An earlier period of struggle, based on the vigorous energy of barbarian intruders, was gradually weakened by the enjoyment of rising standards of living which weakened strife. Enunciating the general rule, "There is no advance without strife," Petrie pictured each cycle as an accelerating decay resulting from a decrease in strife. This point of view, generally accepted by many of the earlier theorists on this subject, saw the later stages of any civilization as a period of decreasing strife or violence, a conclusion which seems to be sharply at variance with the facts. To Oswald Spengler, one of the most famous of modern writers on this subject, a similar pattern was evident. he discerned in each people an earlier stage of vigorous creativity that he called culture and a later stage of weakened moral fiber and devotion to selfish physical comforts that he called civilization. As is usual among writers on this subject, no real explanation was provided for this loss of motion, although the pattern was applied to 10 different cultures. The most famous of recent writers on this subject, Arnold J. Toynbee, has produced the most voluminous and, in spite of its sprawling organization, most satisfactory theory of these processes. He is still strongly influenced by Darwinian biology, and attributes rise and fall of civilizations to the challenge and response to the struggle for existence. In spite of his many improvements over earlier writers, especially in regard to the units to which this pattern applies and the stages through which the pattern takes each unit, Toynbee's theories have several of the prevalent inadequacies of earlier writers, especially in his failure to correlate the stages of change with the process of change and, above all, in his failure to explain why a civilization which has been responding to challenges successfully for centuries gradually ceases to do so, and decays. Most of the earlier writers derived their patterns from the study of a relatively few units, and generally based their interpretations very largely on the Greco-Roman experience in classical antiquity. This reliance on the culture that most of us know best is, of course, to be expected, but has been unfortunate, since the pattern of rise and fall in classical antiquity is not completely typical, as can be seen from the difficulty most writers have had in deciding whether the Greeks and Romans should be treated separately or together. Vico derived his pattern from only 2 examples, Roman and Christian cultures, but most later writers had information, however vague, on a much greater number of cases. Many had no clear idea of the unit we call civilization, and they confused peoples, political units, societies, and even religions in an indiscriminate fashion, greatly increasing the difficulty of finding patterns of change. Danilevsky spoke of 10 historical types, to which he added Russia as an 11th in the future. In general, his units were linguistic groupings, so that the Greeks and Romans were treated as separate units. Spengler also spoke of 10, but his units were different from Danilevsky's and were made very ambiguous in some cases by being based on spiritual outlooks, such as his famous conceptions of Apollonian classical Faustian Western and Magian post-classical Near Eastern cultures. Toynbee sought about 24 civilizations, not much different from those accepted in this present book. The pattern of change in civilizations presented here consists of 7 stages resulting from the fact that each civilization has an instrument of expansion that becomes an institution. The civilization rises while this organization is an instrument and declines as this organization becomes an institution. By the term instrument of expansion we mean that the society must be organized in such fashion that 3 things are true. 1. The society must be organized in such a way that it has an incentive to invent new ways of doing things. 2. It must be organized in such a way that somewhere in the society there is accumulation of surplus, that is, some persons in the society control more wealth than they wish to consume immediately. And 3. It must be organized in such a way that the surplus which is being accumulated is being used to pay for or to utilize the new inventions. All three of these things are essential to any civilization. Taken together, we call them an instrument of expansion. If a producing society is such an organization, an instrument of expansion, we call it the civilization, and it passes through the process we are about to describe. Before we describe this process, however, we should be certain we understand the nature of an instrument of expansion. The three essential parts of an instrument of expansion are incentive to invent, accumulation of surplus, and application of this surplus to the new inventions. Economists might call these three invention, saving, and investment, but the terms used by economists are generally so ambiguous to non-economists that we hesitate to use them. Incentive to invent is sometimes difficult for students to grasp because they assume that all societies are equally inventive, or that necessity is the mother of invention, or that invention is somehow related to innate, hereditary biological talent, so that there are inventive races and non-inventive races. None of these things is true. Some societies, like Mesopotamian civilization or our own Western civilization, are very inventive. Others, like many primitive tribes, or civilizations like the Egyptian, are very uninventive. Nor does necessity have much to do with inventiveness. If it did, those peoples who are pressed down upon the subsistence level, or even below it, in their standards of living, like some of the Indian tribes of the Mato Grosso, would be very inventive, which they are not. Or, if invention were in any way related to necessity, the poverty-stricken fellaheen of Egypt or Transjordan, or the equally hard-pressed coolies of China or the peasants of India would have devised some new and helpful methods for exploiting their available resources. This is far from being the case. Or, again, if biologically inherited talent had anything to do with inventiveness, we would not have seen the great decrease in invention by the Chinese in the last 1,000 years, or the decrease in inventiveness among Anglo-Saxon Americans in the last 100 years, or the sudden appearance of inventiveness among non-inventive peoples of Eastern European stock when they migrated to America. Inventiveness depends very largely on the way a society is organized. Some societies have powerful incentives to invent, because they are organized in such a way that innovation is encouraged and rewarded. This was true of Mesopotamian civilization before 2700 BC, of Chinese civilizations before AD 1200, and of Western civilization during much of its history. On the other hand, many societies are organized so that they have very weak incentives to invent. Suppose that a primitive tribe believed that its social organization was established by a deity who went away leaving strict instructions that nothing be changed. Such a society would invent very little. Egyptian civilization was something like this. Or any society that had ancestor worship would probably have weak incentives to invent. Or a society whose productive system was based on slavery would probably be uninventive, because the slaves, who knew the productive process most intimately, would have little incentive to devise new methods since these would be unlikely to benefit themselves, while the slave owners would have only a distant acquaintance with the productive processes and would be reluctant to invent any new methods that might well require the ending of slavery for their successful exploitation. For these reasons, slave societies, such as classical civilization for the southern states of the United States in the period before 1860, have been notoriously uninventive. No major inventions in the field of production came from either of these cultures. The significance of this can be realized when we recall that at the very time that the South was inventing so little, the North, and especially the people of the Connecticut River Valley, were passing through one of the greatest periods of invention in history: cotton gin, mass production and interchangeable parts, steamboat, screw propeller, revolver, electric motor, vulcanizing rubber, sewing machine, anesthesia, and so forth. Accumulation of surplus means that some persons or organizations in the society have more wealth passing through their control than they wish to use immediately or in the short run. This is so necessary to expansion that it means that some persons must have more than they need, even if others must have less than they need. If a society containing 100 persons is producing 100 square meals a day, it would, perhaps, be just for each person to obtain one meal a day, but such a distribution would never allow the society to increase its production of meals except by temporary and accidental increases called windfalls. If, however, the distribution of square meals in that society is organized so that 50 persons get only half a meal a day, 25 persons get one meal a day each, and 25 persons get 2 meals a day each, it might be possible for the society to increase its production of square meals. This could be done if someone invented a better way of producing square meals, and if the 25 persons who get 2 meals each a day consumed only 1½ meals each day and gave the surplus of 12½ meals each day to 25 of the 50 persons who had only half a meal each in return for their efforts in making the new, more productive invention. This redistribution of meals to obtain the use of a new invention is what we mean by investment, the third essential element in any instrument of expansion. We thus have 3 possible ways in which the 100 meals produced by this society could be distributed. They could be written as follows: type the 100 persons at one meal each 100 meals type at 50 persons at one half meal each 25 meals 25 persons at one meal each 25 meals 25 persons at 2 meals each 50 meals 100 persons total 100 meals with type of distribution. There can be no increase in output even if someone thinks of a new invention, since no one would have leisure to make it. With type B distribution there may be an increase in output but only if someone thinks of a new invention and if the surplus of meals controlled by the 25 richest persons is redistributed to the poorer persons as payment for these poorer ones making the new invention. This would give a third type of income distribution if the surplus was invested in the way mentioned. Thus, type A 25 persons at one half meal each 12.5 meals 50 persons at one meal each 50.0 meals 25 persons at 1.5 meals each 37.5 meals 100 persons total 100 meals every kind of material progress and many kinds of non-material progress depend upon the three factors we have mentioned. This is as true of parasitic societies as it is of productive societies. Let us imagine a solitary savage who lives by hunting and who, by throwing rocks at game from dawn to dusk, averages one rabbit a day. Let us further imagine that this diet of one rabbit a day is just enough to keep him alive until the next day. In such a situation this lonely hunter could not make about an arrow, even if he could invent it in his mind, because to make about an arrow would take, let us say, 10 days' work. Thus this savage has an incentive to invent, even has the necessary invention, but he has no surplus and cannot improve his position. Then let us assume that he throws a rock one day and kills a deer large enough to keep him alive for 12 days. He now has both invention in his mind and surplus the deer. He may live from the deer for 12 days in idleness, or he may use his leisure from hunting to make the bow and arrow he has conceived. In the former case he will be no better off, and may be worse off because of loss of skill in rock throwing as a result of such leisure. In the latter case, on the contrary, his surplus the deer is transformed into a bow and arrow by investment, and at the end of 10 days he has a new weapon that raises his ability to kill rabbits from an average of one a day to, say, an average of 3 a day. Of these 3 he can consume one a day himself, as previously, and support 2 other savages with the 2 other rabbits he kills each day. In return for such support, these 2 could be required to build a hut, to cure rabbit skins, to make additional arrows, and so forth. In this way the new capital equipment, the bow and arrow, has made it possible to raise the standards of living of all 3. It is by some such process as this, but much more elaborate and complex, that civilizations grow, thrive, and expand. Every civilization must be organized in such a way that it has invention, capital accumulation, and investment. Loosely speaking, The term instrument of expansion might be applied to the organization for capital accumulation alone, although, strictly speaking, this organization should be called the surplus creating instrument. This surplus creating instrument is the essential element in any civilization, although, of course, there will be no expansion unless the two other elements, invention and investment, are also present. However, the surplus creating instrument, by controlling the surplus and thus the disposition of it, will also control investment and will, thus, have at least an indirect influence on the incentive to invent. This surplus creating instrument does not have to be an economic organization. In fact, it can be any kind of organization: military, political, social, religious, and so forth. In Mesopotamian civilization it was a religious organization, the Sumerian priesthood, to which all members of the society paid tribute. In Egyptian, Scythian and probably Minoan civilizations it was a political organization, the state that created surpluses by a process of taxation or tribute collection. In classical civilization it was a kind of social organization, slavery, that allowed one class of society, the slave owners, to claim most of the production of another class in society, the slaves. In the early part of Western civilization it was a military organization, feudalism, that allowed a small portion of the society, the fighting men or lords, to collect economic goods from the majority of society, the serfs, as a kind of payment for providing political protection for these serfs. In the later period of Western civilization the surplus creating instrument was an economic organization, the price-profit system, or capitalism, if you wish, that permitted entrepreneurs who organized the factors of production to obtain from society in return for the goods produced by this organization the surplus called profit. Beyond what these factors of production had cost these entrepreneurs, like all instruments, an instrument of expansion in the course of time becomes an institution and the rate of expansion slows down. This process is the same as the institutionalization of any instrument, but appears specifically as a breakdown of one of the three necessary elements of expansion. The one that usually breaks down is the third, application of surplus to new ways of doing things. In modern terms we say that the rate of investment decreases. If this decrease is not made up by reform or circumvention, the two other elements, invention and accumulation of surplus, also begin to break down. This decrease in the rate of investment occurs for many reasons, of which the chief one is that the social group controlling the surplus ceases to apply it to new ways of doing things because they have a vested interest in the old ways of doing things. They have no desire to change a society in which they are the supreme group. Moreover, by a natural and unconscious self-indulgence, they begin to apply the surplus they control to non-productive but ego-satisfying purposes such as ostentatious display, competition for social honors or prestige, construction of elaborate residences, monuments, or other structures, and other expenditures which may distribute the surpluses to consumption but do not provide more effective methods of production. When the instrument of expansion in a civilization becomes an institution, tension increases. In this case we call this tension of evolution. The society as a whole has become adapted to expansion. The mass of the population expect and desire it. A society that has an instrument of expansion expands for generations, even for centuries. People's minds become adjusted to expansion. If they are not better off each year than they were the previous year, or if they cannot give their children more than they themselves started with, they became disappointed, restless, and perhaps bitter. At the same time the society itself, after generations of expansion, is organized for expansion and undergoes acute stresses if expansion slows up. The nature of these organizational stresses and tensions arising from a decrease in the rate of a society's expansion can be seen most clearly in contemporary Western civilization. In this society the economic system produces three kinds of goods: A. Consumers' goods and services. B. Capital goods, which cannot be consumed but which can be used to make consumers' goods. And C. Government goods and services, including armaments. In producing each kind of goods, the factors of production, such as land, labor, materials, capital, managerial skills, entrepreneurial enterprise, legal fees, distribution costs, and so forth, must be used and paid for. These costs, including profits for entrepreneurs, have a double aspect. On the one side they represent the costs of producing the goods, and thus determine the final selling price of the goods. This must be sufficiently high to cover these costs. But, on the other hand, these costs represent the incomes of those who received them and thus represent the purchasing power available to buy the goods offered for sale. If we look, for a moment, only at the flow of consumers' goods, we see that this flow of goods is offered for sale at a price that, by just covering the costs of the goods, is just equivalent to the purchasing power distributed to the economic community as incomes available for buying these goods. But, of course, some incomes are saved. These savings reduce the flow of purchasing power below the level of the flow of consumers' goods at prices sufficient to cover costs of these goods. Thus there is not sufficient purchasing power available to buy the goods being offered at the price being asked, and either goods must go unsold or prices must fall, unless the money which was held back as savings appears in the market as purchasing power for consumers' goods. Traditionally, this reappearance of savings as purchasing power in the market occurred through investment, that is, as expenditures for the factors of production to be used to make capital goods. This process provided the purchasing power needed to permit the flow of consumers' goods to go to consumers because investment distributed rent, salaries, wages, interest, profits, and such to the common community to form incomes and thus available purchasing power, but did not demand purchasing power from the economic community because the producers' goods created by these expenditures were not offered for sale to consumers, as consumers' goods were, but, if sold at all, were merely exchanged for the savings of investors. This whole relationship means that our modern economic system cannot produce and consume what it produces unless it also invests, that is, expands. After centuries of expansion, our society is now organized so that it cannot subsist. It must expand or it will collapse. This relationship might be expressed in the rule that, unless savings are invested in producers' goods, there will not be sufficient purchasing power to buy the consumers' goods that are being produced. Of course, as this problem has become increasingly acute in the contemporary period, a third factor has intervened: government spending. Such government spending provides purchasing power just as investment does. When the factors of production are listed: government cost to make a nuclear submarine, the community obtains incomes available as purchasing power, and no subsequent claim on this purchasing power is made by government action, since the submarine is not offered for sale. Of course, insofar as this government spending is covered by taxes levied on consumers' purchasing power, there is no net increase in such purchasing power, but a considerable part of government spending is covered by taxes on savings and thus operates like investment or is not covered by taxes at all, and thus represents a net increase in purchasing power, an inflationary increase when savings are being invested fully. This rather complicated example of how an expanding society can become so organized for expansion that it enters upon an acute crisis if the expansion rate decreases is worth analyzing, because somewhat similar crises occur in all civilizations when the rate of expansion decreases. And such decrease is the chief result of the institutionalization of the instrument of expansion, something that occurs in every civilization. We shall see many examples of this and the varied ways this process occurs when we make the more detailed analysis of the evolution of various civilizations. Our tentative definition of a civilization was a producing society that has writing and city life. This definition is perfect because it is descriptive rather than analytical. It is also imperfect because it is not completely true. Western civilization about AD 970 had almost no city life, but still was a stage in a civilization. And Andean civilization, even under the Inca Empire, had no writing, but clearly was a civilization. It is now possible to offer a better, if not perfect, definition of a civilization: a producing society with an instrument of expansion. Before we go on to examine the consequences when an instrument of expansion becomes an institution, we might point out that the surplus-creating organization that is such an essential part of any instrument of expansion does not need to be the only surplus-creating organization in the society. In all societies there are other, less significant, surplus-creating organizations than the one we have considered part of the instrument of expansion. In Mesopotamian civilization, the significant surpluses were accumulated by the Sumerian priesthood from types and its own profits. But there can be no doubt that private persons were accumulating surpluses from profits of private enterprise or from the earnings of privately owned slaves or even from voluntary restrictions on their own consumption. These kinds of surplus accumulation may be found in any civilization no matter what preponderance may exist for its own instrument of expansion. In 1850, when Western civilization was most completely organized on the basis of private profit, surplus was undoubtedly being accumulated and invested from government taxes or from private slavery. And we would not be surprised if the most socialistic civilizations, like the Andean under the Incas or the Russian under the Soviets, had a certain amount of private accumulation from profits. These variant and incidental types of surplus accumulation are usually of little significance in a civilization, not only for their relatively small volume of savings but even more because they are not usually expended in productive investment but rather are likely to end up in luxury expenditures and are, thus, little more than postponed or transfer consumption. In theory, however, it must be admitted that our statement that every civilization has an instrument of expansion could well be understood to mean that a civilization has at least one such instrument. Except for one dubious case, we do not know of any civilization, in its prime of life, that has had more than one significant surplus creating organization. We have said that an instrument of expansion, like all instruments, becomes an institution and that as a result the rate of expansion begins to decline. This institutionalization of the organization of expansion, which usually takes the form of a decreasing rate of investment rather than of a decrease in either invention or in accumulation of surplus, leads to a crisis. This crisis, which we have called increasing tension of evolution, arises from the clash between the decreasing rate of expansion, on one hand, and the fact that people's minds and the organization of the society are arranged for expansion, on the other hand. Reserving until later our detailed examination of the forms this crisis takes, we might point out here that it usually gives rise to conflicts between the vested interest groups that control the vested accumulations of surplus because they control the surplus creating organization in the society and are sufficiently satisfied with the existing social organization to desire no change, and the great mass of the population who are discontented at the dwindling prospects of expansion. The growing tension of evolution and the clashes it engenders can result in one of the three possible outcomes to the crisis. These are 1. Reform, 2. Circumvention, or 3. Reaction. We speak of reform when the organization of expansion is rearranged so that it ceases to be an institution and becomes an instrument once more. We speak of circumvention when the vested interest groups are left with much of their privileges intact and when a new instrument of expansion expansion, especially a new surplus accumulating instrument, grows up alongside the older institution and takes over the latter's expansive functions. We speak of reaction when the privileged vested interest groups are able to prevent either reform or circumvention and, in consequence, the rate of expansion continues to decrease. If the outcome is reform or circumvention, the civilization once again has an instrument of expansion and the rate of expansion increases once again. If the outcome is reaction, the decline becomes chronic. There have been several cases where a civilization has succeeded in obtaining reform or circumvention of its institution of expansion, as we shall see in our detailed examination of the process of evolution in individual civilizations. The clearest case to be found is the evolution of our Western civilization, where both circumvention and reform have occurred. As a result, Western civilization has had three periods of expansion. The first about 9701 to 70, the second about 1420 to 1650, and the third about 1725 to 1929. The instrument of expansion in the first was feudalism, which became institutionalized into chivalry. This was circumvented by a new instrument of expansion that we might call commercial capitalism. When this organization became institutionalized into mercantilism, it was reformed into industrial capitalism, which became the instrument of expansion of the third age of expansion in the history of Western civilization. By 1930 this organization had become institutionalized into monopoly capitalism, and the society was, for the third time, in a major era of crisis. A detailed analysis of these changes will be provided later. The process that we have described, which we shall call the institutionalization of an instrument of expansion, will help us to understand why civilizations rise and fall. By a close examination of this process, it becomes possible to divide the history of any civilization into successive stages. We have said that these divisions are largely arbitrary and subjective and could be made in any convenient number of stages. We shall divide the process into 7 stages, since this permits us to relate our divisions conveniently to the process of rise and fall. These 7 stages we shall name as follows. 1. Mixture. 2. Gestation. 3. Expansion. 4. Age of conflict. 5. Universal empire. 6. Decay. 7. Invasion. Every civilization, indeed every society, begins with a mixture of 2 or more cultures. Such mixture of cultures is very common. In fact, it occurs at the boundaries of all cultures to some extent. But such casual cultural mixture is of little significance unless there comes into existence in the zone of mixture a new culture, arising from the mixture but different from the constituent parts. The process is a little like the way in which a mixture of chemicals sometimes produces a new compound different from the mixing chemicals. In the case we are discussing, the new compound is a new society with a new culture. The contributing society ties may be civilizations or merely producing societies agree, cultural or pastoral or merely parasitic societies with hunting or fishing. Of the millions of cases of such cultural mixture that are occurring all the time, only rarely does there appear a new society, and even more rarely does this new society become organized in such a way that it is a producing society with an instrument of expansion. In the rare case where this occurs, we have the first stage of a new civilization. The fact that there have been no more than 24 civilizations in almost 10,000 years of cultural mixture of producing societies will indicate how rare this occurrence is. Since cultural mixture occurs on the borders of societies, civilizations rarely succeed one another in the same geographic area, but undergo a displacement in space. The process may be described somewhat as follows. Within a society, people have little choice as to the ways in which they will satisfy basic needs or fulfill their potentialities. If they are hungry, they eat the food their associates eat, prepared in the fashion customarily used in their society. If they wish companionship, or a picture of their relationship to the universe or a relationship to God or security or shelter or sex or children or whatever they may wish, they obtain these desires largely in the ways and forms provided by their own society. But on the borders of societies there is a considerable mutual interpenetration of social customs, and there arise, accordingly, alternative ways of satisfying two man needs. This is, obviously, particularly true where intermarriage occurs, and where decisions must be taken and choices made as to which customs will be followed. Such choices are imperative in regard to bringing up the children of mixed marriages. When this occurs far enough inside the border of a society for there to be a social majority and consensus, there is no real choice, and, if any effort is made to make a choice, the children themselves will preempt for the local consensus. But in an area of fairly equal mixture, or in an area of unequal mixture where the majority culture is declining and decreasing in prestige, a very real need to make choices arises. These choices in themselves are not very significant in forming a new culture, but two other considerations are important. In the first place, the many choices being made must be morphologically compatible in order to give rise to the necessary amount of integration to permit a body of social custom to arise. And, in the second place, a certain number of families in the same locality must make the same or similar choices. In this way a new society may arise. If this society is productive and if it becomes organized so that it has an instrument of expansion, a new civilization will be born. As a consequence of these conditions, civilizations have generally arisen on the periphery of earlier civilizations. Canaanite, Hittite, and Minoan civilizations arose on the edges of Mesopotamian civilization. Classical civilization was born on the shores of the Aegean Sea, especially the eastern shore, on what was the periphery of Minoan civilization. Western civilization arose in Western Europe, especially in France, which was a periphery of classical civilization, and on other peripheries of classical civilization were born Russian civilization and Islamic civilization. If the new society born from such mixture is a civilization, it has an instrument of expansion. This means that inventions begin to be made, surplus begins to be accumulated, and this surplus begins to be used to utilize new inventions. Eventually, as a result of these actions, the expansion will begin. The interval before such expansion becomes evident, but after the most obvious mixture has ceased, may cover generations of time. This period will be called the stage of gestation. It is stage 2 of any civilization. In general, it is a period in which the society seems to be changing very little, and most people seem to have fairly stable status situations in the social structure. But, under the surface, much of importance is taking place and, above all, the process of investment and invention that will make possible the following period of expansion is taking place. The stage of expansion is marked by 4 kinds of expansion. A. Increased production of goods, eventually reflected in rising standards of living. B. Increase in population of the society, generally because of a declining death rate. C. An increase in the geographic extent of the civilization, for this is a period of exploration and colonization. And D. An increase in knowledge. There are intimate interrelationships among these 4. Increase in production is aided by expanding knowledge. The growth of population helps to increase production as well as to extend the geographic area of the society. The exploration and colonization associated with this extension of the society's geographic area is made possible by the growth of production and the growth of population, both of which permit people to be released for what are, at the beginning at least, non-productive activities such as exploration. The same factors allow people to be released to seek knowledge of various kinds or to engage in non-material activities such as artistic or philosophic activities. While the geographic expansion in itself leads to substantial increases in knowledge, this period of expansion is frequently a period of democracy, of scientific advance, and of revolutionary political change as the various levels of society become adapted to an expanding mode of life from the more static mode of life prevalent in stage 2. As a result of the geographic expansion of the society, it comes to be divided into 2 areas: the core area, which the civilization occupied at the end of stage 2, and the peripheral area into which it expanded during stage 3. The core area of Mesopotamian civilization was the lower valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The peripheral area was the highlands surrounding this valley and more remote areas like Iran, Syria, and Anatolia. The core area of Minoan civilization was the island of Crete. Its peripheral area included the Aegean Islands and the Balkan coast. The core area of classical civilization was the shores of the Aegean Sea. Its peripheral areas were the whole Mediterranean Sea coast and ultimately Spain, North Africa, and Gaul. The court area of Western civilization covered northern Italy, most of France, the Low Countries, England, and extreme western GR. Many, its peripheral areas included the rest of Europe to eastern Poland, North and South America, and Australia. When expansion begins to slow up in the court areas, as a result of the instrument of expansion becoming institution, daylight, and the court area becomes increasingly static and legalistic, the peripheral areas continue to expand by what is essentially a process of geographic circumvention and frequently shortcut many of the developments experienced by the court area. As a result, by the latter half of Stage 3, the peripheral areas are tending to become wealthier and more powerful than the court areas. Another way of saying this is that the court area tends to pass from Stage 3 to Stage 4 earlier than do the peripheral areas. In time, the instrument of expansion becomes an institution throughout the society. Investment begins to decrease, and the rate of expansion, although not expansion itself, begins to decline. As soon as the rate of expansion in a civilization begins to decline noticeably, it enters Stage 4, the age of conflict. This is probably the most complex, most interesting, and most critical of all the 7 stages. It is marked by 4 chief characteristics. A. It is a period of declining rate of expansion. B. It is a period of growing tension of evolution and increasing class conflicts, especially in the court area. C. It is a period of increasingly frequent and increasingly violent imperialist wars. And D. It is a period of growing irrationality, pessimism, superstitions, and other worldliness. The declining rate of expansion is caused by the institutionalization of the instrument of expansion. The growing class conflicts arise from the increasing tension of evolution, from the obvious conflict of interests between a society adapted to expansion and the vested interests controlling the uninvested surpluses of the institution of expansion, who fear social change more than anything else. Usually there is a majority of the frustrated struggling against the minority of vested interests, although usually neither side has any clear idea of the real issues at stake or what would give a workable solution to the crisis. All programs for sharpening the surplus of the few among the discontented many are worse than useless, since expansion can be resumed only if the 3 necessary elements of an instrument of expansion are provided, and the dissipation of surpluses among the large mass of consumers will not provide any one of these 3 necessary elements. On the contrary, most revolutionary programs aroused by the failure of the 3rd element, investment, will merely make the crisis more acute by destroying the 2nd element, accumulation of surplus. The only sensible or workable solution to the crisis of the civilization would be to reform or circumvent the old institution of expansion by establishing again the 3 basic elements of any instrument of expansion. Since the disgruntled masses know nothing about such things, and since the vested interests do not know much more and are usually concentrating their energies on an effort to defend their vested interests, The new instrument of expansion, if it appears, usually does so by accident and through the path of circumvention rather than by reform. If a new instrument of expansion is come into existence, the civilization begins to expand again. The tension of evolution and the crisis subside, and the civilization is once again in stage 3. The age of conflict, stage 4, is a period of imperialist wars and of irrationality supported for reasons that are usually different in the different social classes. The masses of the people who have no vested interest in the existing institution of expansion engage in imperialist wars because it seems the only way to overcome the slowing down of expansion. Unable to get ahead by other means such as economic means, they seek to get ahead by political action, above all by taking wealth from their political neighbors. At the same time they turn to irrationality to compensate for the growing insecurity of life, for the chronic economic depression, for the growing bitterness and dangers of class struggles, for the growing social disruption and insecurity from imperialist wars. This is generally a period of gambling, use of narcotics or intoxicants, obsession with sex frequently as perversion, increasing crime, growing numbers of neurotics and psychotics, growing obsession with death and with the hereafter. The vested interests encourage the growth of imperialist wars and irrationality because both serve to divert the discontent of the masses away from their vested interests, the uninvested surplus. Accordingly, some of the defenders of vested interests divert a certain part of their surplus to create instruments of class oppression, instruments of imperialist wars, and instruments of irrationality. Once these instruments are created and begin to become institutions of class oppression, of imperialist wars, and of irrationality, the chances of the institution of expansion being reformed into an instrument of expansion become almost nil. These three new vested interests in combination with the older vested institution of expansion are in a position to prevent all reform. The last of these three, the old institution of expansion, now begins to lose its privileges and advantages to the three institutions it has financed. Of these three, the institution of class oppression controls much of the political power of the society. The institution of imperialist wars controls much of the military power of the society, and the institution of irrationality controls much of the intellectual life of the society. These three, which may be combined into only two or one, become dominant, and the group that formerly controlled the institution of expansion falls back into a secondary role. Its surplus is largely absorbed by its own creations. In this way, in Mesopotamian civilization, the Sumerian priesthood, which had been the original instrument of expansion, fell into a secondary role behind the secular kings it had set up to command its armies in the imperialist wars of its age of conflict. In the same way, in classical civilization, the slave-owning landlords who had been the original instrument of expansion were largely eclipsed by the mercenary army that had been created to carry on the imperialist wars of the age of conflict but took on life and purposes of its own and came to dominate classical civilization completely. So too the Nazi Party, which had been financed by some of the German monopoly capitalists as an instrument of class oppression, of imperialist war, and of irrationality, took on purposes of its own and began to dominate the monopoly capitalists for its own ends. As a result of the imperialist wars of the Age of Conflict, the number of political units in the civilization is reduced. Eventually one unit emerges triumphant. When this occurs we are in stage 5, the stage of universal empire. Just as the court area passes from stage 3 to stage 4 earlier than the peripheral area does, so the court area comes to be conquered by a single state before the whole civilization is conquered by the universal empire. In Mesopotamia the court area was conquered by Babylonia as early as 1700 BC. But the whole civilization was not conquered by a universal empire until Assyria about 725 BC, replaced by Persia about 525 BC. In classical civilization the court area was conquered by Macedonia about 330 BC. The whole civilization was conquered by Rome about 146 BC. Western civilization has gone from stage 3 to stage 4 3 different times. The 3 ages of conflict are: A. The period of the 100 Years' War, say 1300 to 1430, B. The period of the Second 100 Years' War, say 1650 to 1815, and C. The period of war crisis that began about 1900 and still continues. In each case the court was conquered by an imperialist state, by England under Henry V about 1420, by France under Napoleon about 1810, and by Germany under Hitler about 1942. In the first 2 cases the old institution of expansion, chivalry and mercantilism was circumvented by a new instrument of expansion, commercial capitalism and industrial capitalism, and a new period of expansion meant. In the third case it is too early to see what has happened. We may be getting a new instrument of expansion that will circumvent monopoly capitalism and bring our civilization once again into a period of expansion. Or we may continue in the age of conflict until the whole of our civilization comes to be dominated by a single state, probably the United States. In the imperialist wars of stage 4 of a civilization, the more peripheral states are consistently victorious over less peripheral states. In Mesopotamian civilization the core states like Uruk, Kish, Ur, Nippur, and Lagash were conquered by more peripheral states like Agade and Babylon. These in turn were conquered by peripheral Assyria, and the whole of Western Asia was ultimately conquered by fully peripheral Persia. In Minoan civilization the court area of Crete itself seems to have been conquered by peripheral Mycenae. In classical civilization the court area Ionian states led by Athens were conquered by the semi-peripheral Dorian states Sparta and Thebes, and the whole Greek-speaking world was then conquered by more peripheral Macedonia. Ultimately the whole of classical civilization was conquered by fully peripheral Rome. In the New World the 2 ISO Lated Maize civilizations seem to provide a similar pattern. In Mesoamerica, the core Mayan cities of Yucatan and Guatemala seem to have been overcome by the Semi-Peripheral Toltecs, and these, in turn, by the fully peripheral Aztecs of highland Mexico. In the Andes region, the core area seems to have been along the coast and in the northern highlands of Peru. These cultures were submerged by a number of more peripheral cultures, of which the most successful was the Tiahuanaco from the southern highlands of Peru. And finally, at a late date, not a century before Pizarro, the whole Andean civilization was conquered by the fully peripheral Incas from the forbidding central highlands. In the Far East and Middle East the same sequence can be discerned. The core area of Cynic civilization was in the Huangho Valley. This area was conquered by Zhou about 1000 BC and by Semi-Peripheral Qin from the mountains of Shenxi 8 centuries later, 221 BC. The whole of Cynic society was then brought into a single universal empire by the Han dynasty from its southern periphery 200 BC. AD 220. The Cynic civilization was destroyed by Hunnish nomad invaders before AD 400, and a new civilization, which we call Chinese, began to rise from the wreckage along its southern frontier. The core of this society seems to have been south of the Yangtze River. This core came under a single political rule as early as 700 under the Tang Despotism dynasty. Wider areas were added by successive dynasties, of which the Yuan or Mongols were so remote that they can be regarded neither as peripheral nor even as Chinese. 1368 The Ming 1368 to 1644 were of southern Chinese and thus peripheral origin, and the final universal empire of the Manchus 1644 to 1912 was from the peripheral north, Manchuria, with its original seat of power at Mutton. The history of the Middle East provides similar evidence. We cannot speak with any assurance about the Indus civilization, but it seems likely that its earliest origins were in the lower valleys and are to be seen in the excavations at Chandu Daro, while later it moved northward into the Punjab upper valley and found its universal empire in the originally peripheral Harappa area. After the destruction of this culture by the Aryan invaders from the northwest, the successor Hindu civilization began to arise late 2nd millennium BC in the Ganges Valley. The core area of this new civilization fell under the political control of the local Maurya ca. 540-184 BC and Gupta ca. 320-535 dynasties. Then, as Hindu culture spread over the whole Indian subcontinent, political dominance shifted to peripheral powers such as the Gurjara Pratighar dynasty ca. 740-1036 originating from Central Asiatic pastoral invaders, and a series of Muslim dynasties, mostly Turkish, at Delhi after 1266, culminating in the universal empire of the Mughals 1526 to 1857. In the Islamic civilization a similar pattern seems to have occurred. The core area of this civilization is to be found in western Arabia. as its culture spread over most of Western Asia and Northern Africa. Political domination fell to increasingly peripheral dynasties. The Umayyad Caliphate, of Arabic origin, ruled from Damascus during much of its period 661 to 750, while its successor, the Abbasid Caliphate, ruled from Baghdad 750 ca. 930. The Seljuk Turks ruled briefly 1050 to 1110 from Persia and were ultimately succeeded by the Universal Empire of the Ottoman Turks with its center in Anatolia 1300 to 1922. The victory of more peripheral states over less peripheral states during stage 4 of any civilization seems so well established that it is worthwhile to seek the reasons for it. The number of these can be mentioned. In the first place, as a general rule, material culture diffuses more easily than non-material culture, so that peripheral areas tend to become more materialistic than less peripheral areas, while the latter spend much of their time, wealth, energy, and attention on religion, philosophy, art, or literature. The former spend a much greater proportion of these resources on military, political, and economic matters. Therefore, peripheral areas are more likely to win victories. This contrast is quite clear between, let us say, Sumerians and Assyrians, between Ionians and Dorians, between Greeks and Latins, between Mayas and Aztecs, or even between Europeans and Americans. The second reason for the victories of more peripheral states arises from the fact that the process of evolution is slightly earlier in more central areas than in peripheral ones. Thus the central areas have already passed on to stage 4 and may even have achieved a premature dress rehearsal of stage 5 with the achievement of a single core empire, while peripheral areas are still in a relatively vigorous stage 3. Generally speaking, military victory is more likely to go to an area or state in stage 3 than to one in any later stage, because the later stages and the more central areas are more harassed by class conflicts and are more paralyzed by the inertia and obstruction of institutions. Core areas generally have been ravaged for longer period of imperialist wars. The combination of these obstacles gives the inhabitants of a core area a kind of world weariness, sometimes called a failure of nerve, that is in sharp contrast to their own earlier attitudes or to those of their more peripheral rivals. Accordingly, the task of creating the universal empire is likely to be left to such rivals. It should be noted that in some cases, such as Egypt, Crete, or Russia, a single political unit has ruled over the civilization from its early history. This generally arises in civilizations whose instrument of expansion is a socialist state. In such a case, imperialist wars are not so prevalent a characteristic of stage 4, and the achievement of a single political unit universal empire is not one of the chief characteristics of that stage. As a result, the stage may last a shorter time and cannot be so easily demarcated from earlier and later stages as can be done in civilizations where imperialist war and achievement of a universal empire are two of the most prominent marks of the stage. Absence of these items does not indicate absence of the stage, which is marked by its other, less easily observed, characteristics, such as decreasing rate of expansion, growing class conflicts, declining democracy, dying science, decreasing inventiveness, and growing irrationality. These characteristics and the commonly observed achievement of political domination by a single peripheral state bring the civilization to stage 5, the stage of universal empire. When a universal empire is established in a civilization, the society enters upon a golden age. At least this is what it seems to the periods that follow it. Such a golden age is a period of peace and of relative prosperity. Peace arises from the absence of any competing political units within the area of the civilization itself, and from the remoteness or even absence of struggles with other societies outside. Prosperity arises from the ending of internal belligerent destruction, the reduction of internal trade barriers, the establishment of a common system of weights, measures, and coinage, and from the extensive government spending associated with the establishment of a universal empire. But this appearance of prosperity is deceptive. Little real economic expansion is possible because no real instrument of expansion exists. New inventions are rare, and real economic investment is lacking. The vested interests have triumphed and are living off their capital, building unproductive and blatant monuments like the pyramids, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colosseum, or as premature examples Hitler's Chancellery and the Victor Emmanuel Memorial. The masses of the people in such an empire live from the waste of these non-productive expenditures. The golden age is really the glow of overripeness, and soon decline begins. When it becomes evident, we pass from stage 5 universal empire to stage 6 decay. The stage of decay is a period of acute economic depression, declining standards of living, civil wars between the various vested interests, and growing illiteracy. The society grows weaker and weaker. Vain efforts are made to stop the wastage by legislation. But the decline continues. The religious, intellectual, social, and political levels of the society begin to lose the allegiance of the masses of the people on a large scale. New religious movements begin to sweep over the society. There is a growing reluctance to fight for the society or even to support it by paying taxes. This period of decay may last for a long time, but eventually the civilization can no longer defend itself, as Mesopotamia could not after 400 BC, as Egypt could not about the same time, as Crete could not after 1400 BC, as Rome could not after AD 350, as the Incas and Aztecs could not after 1500, as India could not after 1700, as China could not after 1830, and as Islam could not after 1850. Stage 7 is the stage of invasion, when the civilization, no longer able to defend itself because it is no longer willing to defend itself, lies wide open to barbarian invaders. These invaders are barbarians only in the sense that they are outsiders. frequently these outsiders are another, younger, and more powerful civilization. As a result of these invasions by an outside society, the civilization is destroyed and ceases to exist. This stage of invasion is also a period of mixture. As such, it may be, but does not need to be, stage 1 of a new civilization. The invasions of the Greek tribes, which ended the Minoan civilization, marked stage 1 of classical civilization. The invasions of the Germanic tribes, which ended classical civilization, marked stage 1 of Western civilization. The 7 stages are merely a convenient way of dividing a complex historical process. This process is not relentlessly deterministic at all points but merely at some points, in the sense that men have power and free will but their actions have consequences nevertheless. In general, if cultural mixture produces a new producing society with an instrument of expansion, we have stage 1 of a civilization. Stages 2, 3, and 4 will follow inevitably. This means that, if a producing society is an instrument of expansion, saving and investment will lead to expansion, and this expansion will eventually slow up as the instrument becomes an institution. At this point, in the early part of stage 4, there is considerable freedom since the institutionalized instrument of expansion may be reformed or circumvented. If it is, expansion will be resumed, and the civilization will again be in stage 3. If it is not reformed or circumvented, reaction will triumph, and the crisis will become worse. The choice between reform and reaction is not, however, the rigid one. The last part of stage may third be a continual series of minor reforms and circumventions to the point where the creation of new instruments just about balances the institutionalization of old instruments, and expansion continues at a fair rate for a considerable time. Circumvention, especially geographic circumvention, may force institutions that would not otherwise have reformed to do so in order to compete. Thus, for example, as the textile industry of New England became institutionalized, new, more modern plants grew up in the South. The existence of these southern plants, a case of geographic circumvention, forced the textile mills of New England either to modernize or to perish. On a more dramatic scale, the whole industrial system of England, in recent times, has been in an institutionalized condition and has been faced with the choice of reforming, thus creating new economic activities and new economic organizations, or perishing from the competition of peripheral areas, like the United States, or semi-peripheral areas, like Germany, or even other civilizations, like Japan or India. Because of such conditions as these, the whole first part of the age of conflict, stage 4, is a period of crisis and of hope. Only when the vested interests create new instruments of class oppression, of imperialist wars, and of irrationality, and when these new instruments, in turn, begin to become institutions, does hope fade. Crisis becomes endemic in the civilization, and continues until the universal empire with its golden age is established. In those civilizations that had a single political unit from an earlier stage, like Egyptian, Minoan, or Orthodox civilization, the age of conflict is frequently of briefer duration because imperialist wars are of limited extent. The fact that these one-state civilizations frequently have a socialist state as their instrument of expansion also serves to obscure the duration of the age of conflict because such a civilization has weak incentives to invent in its age of expansion and less dramatic class conflicts in its age of conflict, thus serving to obscure the transition from one of these stages to the other. In theory, there is nothing rigid about stage 5. So far as observations of past civilizations indicate, every civilization passes from the age of conflict to the age of universal empire. That means that one state, probably a peripheral one, emerges triumphant over the whole area of the civilization. But in theory it is at least conceivable that the competing states of stage 4 might just fight each other down and down to lower and lower levels of prosperity and public order without one emerging triumphant over all the others. In such a case, stage 5 might be omitted, and the civilization would pass directly from stage 4 to stage 6 conflict to decay without achieving any universal empire. Something like this may have been true of Mesoamerican civilization. In a similar way, it is conceivable, in theory, that a civilization could continue for a very long time in the stage of decay without passing on to stage 7. For there can be no invasion to end the civilization unless there are invaders to come. In Egypt, for example, was so well protected by seas and deserts against invaders that its stage of decay lasted for more than 1,000 years. It is also, in theory, conceivable that some universal empire someday might cover the whole globe, leaving no external barbarians to serve as invaders. This point leads to one final consideration, namely, the relationship of outside societies to any civilization. In theory again, it would seem that an outside society that was stronger than a given civilization might at any time come in and smash it. In practice, however, it seems that civilizations are in little danger of such an experience except early or late in their careers. In general, a civilization is in no danger from any society except another civilization from stage 2 to stage 6. In stage 6, however, it is in danger from any society, even the parasitic one, as is clear from the destruction of Cretan, Classical, Hittite, and Cynic civilizations by non-civilized invaders. When two civilizations collide, we may use the tentative rule that the victory will go to the one that is closer to stage 3 expansion, but that neither one will be destroyed unless it is in stage 6. In 492–479 BC Classical civilization, in stage 3, and Mesopotamian civilization, in the last part of stage 5, collided, and the former one, in 336–323 they collided again. with Classical in Stage 4 and Mesopotamian in Stage 6, and the latter was destroyed. In 2641–46 BC, Classical civilization in Stage 4 met Canaanite civilization in Stage 6, and destroyed it. In 711–81 for West Urn civilization in Stage 2 was able to preserve itself against Islamic civilization in Stage 3. 300 years later, in what we call the Crusades, Western civilization in Stage 3 returned the visit to Islamic civilization, then in Stage 4, but could not destroy it. However, in 1850–1920, Western civilization, just reaching the end of Stage 3, again collided with Islamic civilization, now in Stage 6, and destroyed its unique, vassal empire, the Ottoman Empire, and probably liquidated the whole civilization, a process that is still going on. This was only one of several civilizations that were in a similar stage and that have met, or appear to be now meeting, a similar fate. The other universal empires in Stage 6 that have been destroyed by Western civilization while in Stage 3 are the Inca, the Aztec, the Manchu, the Mughal in India, and perhaps the Tokugawa in Japan. At the present time, India seems to be in Stage 2 of a new civilization. China may be in Stage 1 of a new civilization, while the situation in Japan and in the Near East is still too chaotic to make any judgments about what is happening. Russian civilization, which began about AD 500 and had its period of expansion about 1500–1900, had the state as its instrument of expansion and was just entering upon Stage 4 in 1917 when the reform of this institution gave it a new instrument of expansion. As a result, Russian civilization has been in Stage 3 for the second time in recent years, but it remains a relatively weak civilization because of its weak incentives to invention. A collision between this civilization, which is early in Stage 3, and Western civilization, which has just begun Stage 4, would probably be indecisive in its outcome. If Western civilization reforms and again passes into Stage 3, it will be far too powerful to be defeated by Russian civilization. If Western civilization does not reform, but continues through the stage of conflict into the stage of universal empire, the threat from Russian civilization will be much greater. However, by that time the new Indian civilization or the new Chinese civilization may be in Stage 3 and will present greater threats to both Western and Russian civilizations than either of these will present to the other. If Western civilization reforms in the present time as appears highly likely, or if any revolutionary new technological discovery such as the conquest of photosynthesis is made in the near future, this whole relationship will be modified. Returning from the unknown future to the partially known past, we can conclude this chapter by a chart that gives, in a rough fashion, the chronology of the 7 stages for the civilizations with which we shall be most concerned.